Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the RV show. My name is Rohan.
And my name is Vinay. So while in the US, we may be feeling that the COVID pandemic has decreased, with there now even being 25 states without a mask mandate in place at the time of recording, the COVID pandemic has reached what people are calling the second wave of coronavirus in India. While India luckily does not have as many deaths, at least of those reported, with only 7% of the worldwide deaths despite 14% of the worldwide cases. Recently, there have been many cases, with over 400,000 cases being reported a day on May 18th. And overall, since the month of April, the amount of cases has shot up, as you can see on the graph, especially in Maharashtra, and more specifically Mumbai, which is where a lot of my family lives. There have been over 4.9 million cases reported in that state. The effects have been so great that the Indian Premier League, a cricket league that is basically the equivalent of the NFL or NBA for India, has been suspended indefinitely, despite many claiming that the biobubble in use was probably the safest place in the country to not contract the virus, as apparently just two players going for scans in a lesser populated hospital, despite wearing full PPE equipment, contracted the virus and the bubble was breached. So, Rohan, we both have family in India. And while I would consider my family pretty lucky that even though there have been a decent amount of cases in my extended family, I've not heard of a death. I'm not sure how your family is dealing with the pandemic. So, how's it been with you?
Yeah, well, luckily, I haven't had that many cases within my extended family in India. And actually, like a pretty funny story is that one of my extended family members in India was is in his 80s, and so he was definitely being careful about who he came into contact with. And just one he came into contact with one person after 8 months of solitary confinement without coming into contact with anyone, and he got the virus. And luckily, he recovered after a week, and he's fine now. But it just shows like how variable this virus is and how easy it is to catch it, especially in India.
Yeah, I agree. I think both of us are pretty lucky, but we have to recognize that there are a lot of families that are a lot less fortunate in India right now.
Right. And I have friends who have had uh, even like 10 family members die within the past week.
Yeah. So earlier when the pandemic was not as rampant in India, in about February, India sent over 20 million vaccines to neighboring countries such as Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka. And they even sent abroad to Brazil, Barbados, and other countries over there. But as of May 7th, they were still the third largest exporter of the vaccine outside of just China and the European Union, when you see all of the vaccines that they've distributed over the whole COVID pandemic. So do you think all that distribution was a bit premature? Or do you think with at that time there's only 9,000 cases, and I say 9,000 with an only in comparison today. Do you think it was the right decision to send all of those vaccines that I think we're almost in dire need of right now?
Well, I think it was absolutely the right decision. I think just first, what we have to realize is that it's hard to predict what's going to happen in the future. And really, if any country is in a place where they can help their neighboring countries and they feel like they're in a stable position, then they want to do that. And I feel like, especially in smaller countries, for instance, Nepal or Sri Lanka, who might not have the infrastructure like India does. And it's kind of funny that I'm saying that because India is really suffering right now. It's
Mhm.
important to help out those countries. And even in Nepal, they're actually seeing kind of like this second phase that you talk about with India. So I think it's really important to help these countries, even if you think you're in a stable position.
Well, in one way, I do agree that it is important, obviously, to help some of the smaller countries and even other countries around the world. But I do think that the Indian government had more of a obligation to help its own citizens, because obviously India isn't, for example, like the United States, where there's a lesser population and it's a pretty spread out place. Like in India, there's so many different places and especially villages across India. We might think that, oh, like if you look at Mumbai or if you look at Bangalore or somewhere like that or Chennai, you will actually see a lot more distribution of the vaccines, but harder to reach
Right.
places. There are so many different villages in India that still have to like properly get the vaccine. So I'm not sure if I would agree on the point that India had the obligation to help, say, Brazil, who are also receiving help from the European Union and
Right,
China
definitely.
and Russia. Because I do think
Yeah,
that India still has an obligation to help its own citizens.
I guess to just clarify, I kind of agree with you. I just think that generally, if they're in a stable position, and I think India might not have been in a stable position, and I don't think like Prime Minister Modi was really looking at all over the country. He was only looking at the major cities, which is a problem. But I think if they are in a stable position, that's when you can probably give. But
Yeah, I understand that point. So, do you think that the Indian government or even like foreign countries like Russia, China, or the US, and this also applies to India, kind of before they started providing vaccines only to themselves recently, do you think they're doing enough to restrict the spread of the virus in India and other places where the pandemic has really risen? And do you think that there's a moral obligation of those countries to help certain countries out?
yeah, so I think just specifically looking at India, I definitely don't think they're doing enough um, to help like curb the pandemic. And I know a lot of people can say that that's like an insensitive statement and they're doing as much as they can, but really we don't see anything good coming out of India's government. If anything, they're focusing on the wrong things. Like very recently, Prime Minister Modi actually released like a brand new like infrastructure plan, like billion or trillion dollar infrastructure plan for the government buildings, and it just shows like a very clear disconnect between what the people of India really need and what the government is focusing on. In regard to some like the moral obligation you were talking about, I definitely think that, as I said before, if a country is stable and is being able to curb the pandemic, for instance, in the U.S., a lot of states are on like a downward trend for COVID cases per day. That's when you can start branching out and giving resources to other countries and helping. But you have to make sure you're stable. It's kind of like the classic airplane, like putting on your like mask on an airplane when like oxygen is low, like you help
Mhm.
yourself before you help others.
Actually, I think that's a really good metaphor because I think I completely agree with you on the point that you obviously have to get your own citizens stable and under control. But after that, it is important to make sure that others are also okay. And as for your point on the Indian government, I think I'd also completely agree on that. Because I think just a few months ago, obviously the COVID pandemic wasn't that much in India, but you could see like people running their political rallies and all so feverishly, and everyone was working so hard. While I'm not saying that the Indian government isn't working hard at this point in time, I really don't think that at least one and like during April one, the second wave kind of started. I don't think there's that much of passion put into it until like just now when it's reaching like record amount of cases where India's has become the second most country with most COVID cases. And I really think that there is more of an obligation, especially from some of the state ministers. Like obviously Modi has a lot to do, but at the same time, you could say he's the prime minister of the whole country. It's tough for him to help out in places other than just the major cities. But I think, like for example, in Maharashtra as a whole, right now we're really focusing on Mumbai and Pune, which are obviously two of the major cities. But I think there does need to be more of an outreach into all places of the state, and I think that's one place
I
where the
completely agree.
Indian government is lacking.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
Okay, so on this first section, we focused more on India, but this coronavirus has obviously had a deadly effect on the whole world, and many countries were actually depending on India's vaccine shipments, which they've obviously had to cut down with so many domestic cases. So the European Union and now more recently Biden and the US are trying to support other countries. But China's vaccine, which is the most exported vaccine, does not have much confidence from the people that are actually taking them, from like Brazil, Pakistan, or some African countries. I was even reading this quote where a worker in Zimbabwe said that he's been told that the Chinese vaccines are meant to, quote, get rid of Africans. And he expressed reluctance at taking the vaccine along with many other Africans, as he said that he doesn't really want to be part of an experiment with an outcome that he doesn't know of. So, what do you think the global effect has been of India's struggle, and how do you think it can be solved, if it can be solved?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of pretty big impacts. I think first, what we've seen is simply that deaths, even in a concentrated in one country, are going to impact the whole world, whether it's through family members, friends. Like, obviously, deaths in India are going to impact us because we have family members in India.
Mhm.
I think another pretty major way is it's kind of shown the importance of global support structures and alliances. And I think we've seen this through people pushing the US to really help and support India. And we've seen that it's really important for each and every country to have a good support structure so that if they ever get into a crisis like this, they're able to get out of it. And I think what you mentioned about the Chinese vaccines is really interesting because we've seen a lot of controversies with the Chinese vaccines, specifically within China's government. One story I actually read is in Hong Kong, all the esteemed scientists are getting the Pfizer vaccine, and all of the government officials are getting the Sinovac vaccine or Sinovac, whatever it's pronounced, which shows like a pretty interesting like connection between um, like state-based vaccines and who really gets them and whether one is like more reliable than the other. And it's my personal opinion that you should get whatever vaccine is available to you. But obviously there's some that appear to be more safe than others.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you brought up on the Chinese government, because obviously once you see that some of the more higher ranking officials are getting a different vaccine from the general public, I think it's important to question whether you're actually taking the vaccine that'll protect you the most. And do you think that countries like China, Russia, and the US should try to support other countries? I know you're talking about how this has really highlighted the importance of having good ties. For example, you can't just have an alliance with India because, for example, right at this point in time, they're not able to help you with vaccines. But if you have a alliance with someone like the US, at this point in time, you could still rely on them for the use of vaccines. So do you think some of the more powerful countries, do you think they're doing enough at this point in time?
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, I think it's very dependent on the situations of those countries. I think what we've seen is there have been social movements pushing these countries to actually distribute vaccines and make a difference. I think that's pretty important because I feel like both the US and China, once they were kind of curbing the coronavirus and kind of lowering cases, still they weren't immediately going to helping other countries, but it did take some pushing. Um, but I do think it's pretty important that they do this.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think in the US, luckily, we've been able to reach a position where it seems like COVID is on the downfall. Obviously, I'll pray for one, but there could obviously be a second or third wave. So the US needs to have the infrastructure in place to deal with that potential crisis. But I do think it's important, especially in India, when you're getting how much? Over 400,000 cases a day. If I think it's more important to help those countries out that really need the help at this point in time immediately.
Yeah, definitely. So I think we've done a pretty good job of covering this story about vaccines, not only around the world, but also looking at India's COVID crisis. Now it's time to move on to the W segment. So our first story, Vinay, comes out of Detroit River in Michigan, where fishermen recently just found a massive sturgeon. And by massive, I mean seriously massive. They caught a fish that was 6 feet, 10 inches, and 240 pounds. That's like a pro basketball player. And what's even more interesting is that this has scientific implications because this catch, they believe that this fish was probably over 100 years old.
Wow. Well, I think that's a really walloping sturgeon. I mean, that's absolutely gigantic and crazy. And that last detail that you provided, that she's probably more than 100 years old, I think that's really going to impact how we look at how we look at fish, specifically sturgeon. And like we always map out the lifespan of many of these fish, but to be over 100 years old is absolutely crazy.
Yeah, definitely. So the second story comes out of a Japanese town called Noto. And this town is specifically known for its like giant squid catching and squid fishing. And this is pretty important to the city. And we've known that Japan has definitely been struggling with COVID. But what this town decided to do is instead of using its spare money to spend on coronavirus relief, what it did was it bought a giant squid statue. So now in the middle of Noto, this Japanese city, is a big pink squid statue. And it costs $200,000. It's 13 feet high and 29 feet long. And they hope it brings in more tourism.
Hmm.
What do you think about that?
I'm not sure it's the most worthwhile investment when you're looking at what exactly your town needs at that point in time, because obviously they're struggling with the COVID pandemic. And in the middle of a pandemic, if you're more focused on tourism, especially when tourism, there's not going to be many tourists going to Japan with their current state right now. I'm not sure if it's the most worthwhile investment that they could have made to help their citizens.
Yeah, definitely. I can agree with that to some extent. But also, what are you going to do with $200,000?
Probably
So
look to help your citizens.
I guess that's true. So the third story comes out of Nebraska, where there was a massive pool noodle fight in the middle of a field. But coincidentally, everyone who was fighting was named Josh. And this has been dubbed the Josh fight or the Josh battle royale by a lot of different people. And this is essentially a big fight that happened in Nebraska where a bunch of people named Josh came together and fought each other, and a little 4-year-old kid won the fight. This actually what originally started from a Facebook meme where a man named Josh Swain brought a bunch of people named Josh randomly together into a group chat and told them, in 1 year, we're going to meet each other and fight to see who gets to be the final Josh. And it became viral, and so many people showed up surprisingly. What do you think about that?
I mean, I know this is a W segment and I'm supposed to give a W adjective, but I think it'd just be wrong for me to use any adjective other than Josh. Because how many people were there again? I think there are over 1,000 people at this account. I mean, at this event, and they're all named Josh. I think that's absolutely crazy. And the only description that I can really use for that is just Josh.
Yeah, I yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think Josh is like a perfect word to probably describe this event. And I guess we really see that this shows like a revival of like pandemic communications and seeing how people were able to come together simply off of social media, even in like a far off state than where a lot of people might live.
I think I was just watching one of the videos over there, and I noticed that most of the people were wearing masks. So in one way, that's good that I
Right.
think they're still being aware of the pandemic. But at the same time, it is good to see some massive events. Hopefully, there are no COVID cases that came out of that, though.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So now onto our fourth story, which comes from actually the website of Amazon. And we've seen people doing massive shopping sprees on Amazon, but we've never seen something like this, where a little 4-year-old boy from New York, who obviously loves SpongeBob a lot, bought 51 cases of SpongeBob popsicles, 918 to be exact. That cost $2,600. And obviously, her mom is freaking out as Amazon initially told the mother that they wouldn't take back the ice lollipops. But there was a happy ending where people came together in a fundraiser and raised more than $14,000 to help pay for those.
I think this has to be described as a money-winning effort from this child. He's earned his parents more than $10,000 that they could actually use for his future education through this effort. So I think it's just a winning effort from him.
Yeah, definitely. And the kid got a ton of popsicles. So
Oh yeah,
that's
that's true.
another pro. Cool. Now on to our fifth story. Elon Musk's brain implants. Now, we've seen Elon Musk really take on this project of Neuralink, and we've seen the possible ramifications of this project as Elon Musk really wants to help people with disabilities. And this project has already seen some sort of effects. For instance, we've seen Elon Musk's brain implants already teach a monkey to play Pong using its mind. And Pong is obviously a game like ping pong where you have different paddles on each side. And this was a really interesting breakthrough because we've seen how this simple product, Neuralink, can actually make a big difference. And we've already seen it happening in animals.
I think it's wonderful to see such development. I mean, for something, it might seem like a simple game of Pong, but it really is quite complex to get someone to understand the reasoning of that game and to be able to use their minds to almost like control the computer or phone. So I think this is actually a wonderful development in Neuralink and the future for its programs for helping people of all disabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great way to end the W segment for today with such a great scientific breakthrough here with Elon Musk really hoping to help people in the future.
Okay, so that wraps up our show for today. Please watch next week. We'll have an engaging story to tell you all. Goodbye.
Great, thank you. Bye. What's up, everyone? Rohan here from the RV Show. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to stay updated on all of our new content. Also, if you are looking for past episodes, check out our YouTube playlist.